Thank you so much for joining me today. I am so excited to talk about Jews in World War II China. We're going to take a tour of Shanghai, Harbin, Tianjin, and Hong Kong. We'll start with Shanghai because it had the largest Jewish population. It also had the most diverse Jewish population. This is Shanghai in the 30s. It was a very international city. It was run by the British, the French, the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans. It was a city of vice. There was prostitution, gambling, guns, political assassination. It was a very international city because it was administered by all those countries, and it was a very open city, and it was a good place to be Jewish. Victor Sassoon was one of the leading real estate developers in the 20s and 30s. His family had come to Shanghai from Baghdad and Bombay. They made their riches in opium trading. And Victor was responsible for many of the buildings from that time that still remain. One is the Cathay Hotel. This was built in 1929. It was the place to stay in Shanghai. All the dignitaries and celebrities and writers stay there. Victor had a penthouse underneath that pyramid roof. There was also a ballroom up there that was very central to Shanghai nightlife. The Cathay has since been renamed the Peace Hotel, and it is now owned by Fairmont. Victor built the Cathay Theater in 1932. So if you were in Shanghai during the war, you could see the latest American movie at the Cathay Theater. It still stands today, and it is still being run as a movie theater. Ol Rachel was one of 7 temples that were in existence in Shanghai during the war. It was built by Victor's uncle, Jacob Sassoon. Now, Jacob's wife Rachel had died, so he named it after her. Ol Rachel means the house of Rachel. Sadly, Jacob himself passed away several months before the temple was completed. But this was one of the leading synagogues for the Sephardic families in Shanghai. And it is one of 2 synagogues that still remain in Shanghai today. The building this one is being used as a temple. An Orthodox group uses it on the weekends and for weddings and bar and bat mitzvahs, but they've decided to keep the ivy to remind them of the hospitality that the Jews received during the war. The other temple that's still in existence today is the Jewish Refugee Museum, which was the former Ol Moshe synagogue. And Ol Moshe was central to Russian Jewish life. And the Russian Jews came to Shanghai in the 1920s. They fled the Soviet Union, and although they weren't prosperous like the Sephardic Jews, like the Sassoons, they did quite well because they received help in food and shelter and job opportunities from the Sephardic Jewish community. This building now is the Jewish Refugee Museum, and it's central to the Shanghai Jewish tour in Shanghai, obviously. The Kadoorie family is another Sephardic family. They also came from Baghdad and Bombay. They worked for the Sassoons, and they became very prosperous themselves. They spent time between Shanghai and they split time between Shanghai and Hong Kong, and we'll meet them again when we get to Hong Kong. But this is their house in Shanghai, and it's now the Shanghai Children's Palace. It's a school for performing arts, and I wanted to show you this house because while the Sephardic Jewish families did quite well, most of the Jews in Shanghai lived in places like this. This is the Shanghai ghetto. Most of the Jews that came from Germany and Austria arrived in 1938 through 1941. There were some doctors and dentists that came as early as 1933. But in 1938, 1939, things in Europe were getting really bad for the Jews. And it wasn't quite the time where they were rounded up into and sent to concentration camps, but life there was very grim. And in those years, they were given the choice. They could either leave or else. And if they left, they would have a week. They would have maybe 2 weeks, a month at the most. They could take what they could wear, very little money, and a suitcase. And when they went to a travel agent and they said they had to leave within 2 weeks, and they had no visa to enter another country, and they had maybe no passport, they asked where could they go, and the answer was Shanghai. This is the Shanghai ghetto now. And the reason that Shanghai was open was because the port was open. When people arrived there up until 1941, they could stay. And if you couldn't afford an apartment, the Jews from Germany and Austria would live in dormitories. They were separated by gender, so these women are congregating around their bunk beds, and they are with all of their possessions that they own. This man is in his bunk reading a newspaper, and the newspapers available to the Jews back then were plenty. There were newspapers printed in Russian, in Yiddish, in German, and in English. And they really created a community there thanks to the Sephardic Jews who provided shelter and food, and they campaigned American relief agencies endlessly. So those agencies sent over relief workers. And through all of this, the Jews had a very strong sense of community, and they always were able to keep their dignity. Even though they had to line up like this every day for lunch, with 20,000 refugees, they couldn't all possibly be fed at once. This is a dining hall. And even to this day, those Jews that still are alive that came from Shanghai are so proud to call themselves the Shanghai Jews, and they have reunions every once in a while to get together to talk about these times. And the conditions were dismal, but the community was rich as far as spirit. So there are a couple of books written from back then, and one is China to Me by Emily Hahn. It was published in 1944. Emily Hahn was an American. She was born in St. Louis, raised in Chicago's North Shore. She went to school at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and studied engineering. But Emily Hahn was so ahead of her time that even a job in engineering was boring to her. So in 1935, she and her sister Helen went to Shanghai. They planned to stay for 3 months and make Shanghai their base, and they would travel around China. But when Emily arrived in Shanghai, she knew it was home. So when her sister wanted to go into the interior, she stayed in Shanghai. And when her sister thought it was time to go home after 3 months, she stayed in Shanghai. Emily wasn't just a tourist. She became very close friends with Victor Sassoon. And Victor would invite her to parties at the Cathay Hotel. He would take her to the horse races. And she really made Shanghai a big part of her life. It was where she wanted to be. She started a scandalous affair with a Chinese poet. He was married, and his being married wasn't the scandalous part. It was more that because Chinese men had concubines and mistresses back then, and it was legal. But the scandalous part was that Emily went to his house and took tea with his wife and kids and went out on outings with them, and it was very unusual for foreigners to go to Chinese homes back then. Emily supported herself by writing for the New Yorker magazine. She was their China correspondent. She also was working on a biography of the Sung sisters, and they were the 3 most prominent women in China at the time. They had married the 3 most powerful men. But in 1941, things were getting very dangerous in China. The war between the Chinese and the Japanese was intensifying. So 2 of the sisters went to Hong Kong to wait it out. And they told Emily if she wanted to interview them, she'd have to go to Hong Kong. So she planned to go for 3 months, just like she had planned to go to China for 3 months. Well, just like her plans with China didn't pan out, her time in Hong Kong went from 3 months to 2 years, because on Pearl Harbor Day, the Japanese bombed both Hong Kong and Shanghai, and she was unable to return to Shanghai and never went back. But before she left, she had Mr. Mills, that was her monkey, and he went with her everywhere. If Victor Sassoon invited her to a party at the Cathay Hotel, she'd take Mills, she'd put a diaper on him, so she wouldn't have to worry about that. And sadly, when she went to Hong Kong for her supposedly 3-month stay there, she never saw Mills again because he had stayed in Hong Kong. In Shanghai. But we'll pick up with Emily's story when we get to Hong Kong, and it's just as scandalous as it was in Shanghai. The other book from that time that is by a Jewish woman is Vicky Baum's Shanghai 37. Vicky Baum was also ahead of her time. She wasn't as risque as Emily Hahn, But she was a mother and a wife in Vienna. She wrote romance novels at night when her kids slept. And she hit it big with a more mainstream novel called Grand Hotel. In 1931, Grand Hotel was being made into a film in Hollywood, and Vicki Baum went to Los Angeles to oversee the production to make sure that the film was true to her concept of the novel. She loved the U.S. so much that she brought her family over, her husband and her kids. And they immigrated there, became Americans, and in 1937, she went to Shanghai. And she planned to also go for 3 months. And while she did only stay for several months, I felt like Vicki Baum really understood Shanghai. She understood the dynamics of the different cultures, the problems there, the politics. And her novel, Shanghai 37, is about the types of people in Shanghai at the time. She's a character who's white Russian, a Jewish refugee from Germany. There's a German refugee who's not Jewish. There's a Japanese character, a French character, an American, British, a Chinese gangster, a Chinese coolie. And the first part of her book is dedicated to biographies of each of these characters. And we learn their backstory, where they came from, how they ended up in Shanghai, how they ended up at the Cathay Hotel. And the second part is about how they all intertwine. And sometimes they know it and sometimes they don't. And it culminates when the Cathay Hotel is bombed in 1937 and some of the characters die. So I thought Vicki Baum did an excellent job of getting to the core of Shanghai society. Now, her book, like Emily Hahn's, did not center on Jewish life there. They did touch upon it. Emily Hahn became involved in the relief efforts spearheaded by Victor Sassoon because she was good friends with him, but she doesn't talk about Jewish life very much there besides that. But some books that have been published more recently do. Shanghai Shadows is a young adult novel by Lois Ruby. It centers around a girl named Ilsa who comes from Vienna with her family. They're one of those that have to leave at the last minute. Her older brother Eric is involved in the resistance against the Japanese. Ilsa herself has free range of the city. She meets a Chinese street urchin. She meets other Jewish refugees. And in 1941, when the Japanese invade and take Shanghai, all the Jews from Austria and Germany are sent to the Shanghai ghetto, no matter where they had lived in Shanghai before. And that was the building we saw earlier in our tour. And even though food was very short and disease was rampant, the Jews still kept their sense of community. Victor Sassoon and the Kadoris helped so much, as much as they could. And I think throughout that, the Jews always felt like someone cared. And they didn't even know what was going on in Europe at the time. I mean, the news didn't come out until much later, but they knew that they were being given a second chance there, and they always appreciated that. Another book written about that time that centers on the Jewish community is The Far Side of the Sky. It's written by Daniel Kalla, who is a Vancouver ER doctor. Now, Daniel Kalla has written some medical thrillers, but The Far Side of the Sky is his first historic novel. And like many of us, he did not know about this part of Jewish history. He and his wife were in Shanghai several years ago. They were on a tour, and the tour guide just casually mentioned the Jews from Shanghai during the war. And he had no idea what she was talking about. So when he did some research, he became so intrigued by this that he dedicated this book to that story. And his main character is a doctor named Franz Adler, who comes from Vienna and interacts with other Jews in Shanghai, including a British doctor who wants to put him in his place because he's a European and the British look down on them, even the Jews. And there was a hierarchy. Even though they all did help each other out, there was a hierarchy there. And Franz also becomes friends with an American relief worker from New York, who might come from decent means, but he's very egalitarian, and he helps the Franz Adler and his family find shelter and food and jobs. An ethical dilemma that Daniel Kalla presents is Franz Adler is asked to operate on German and Japanese people, and although they're on the side that friends, others, against. He has to think about if he puts himself as a doctor first or as a Jewish refugee first. And that was a very interesting dilemma that was addressed in the book. So I thought those are all very excellent books about Shanghai during the war. I have a bibliography that has others that also center on this time. And I'll pass it out later. Our next stop is Harbin. Harbin is way up in the northeast of China. It is very cold. It's surrounded by Siberia. It is north of Korea. Korea is that little peninsula jutting out to the right. And it was settled by Russian Jews, both before the Bolshevik Revolution and after. This is Harbin in 1930s, and the signs are in Japanese because the Japanese invaded that part of China in 1931. So war came early to China. This is a Jewish girl and a Chinese girl in Harbin. This is the temple in Harbin. This is the inside, and the building still stands. It's not being used as a temple anymore. This is the Harbin Jewish Middle School. This is the Harbin Jewish Hospital. And these buildings are still there. They're part of a Harbin Jewish tour, but they're not being used by Jews right now. Beitar was a Zionist youth group that started in Latvia, and it was popular in China. There were branches in Harbin, Tianjin, and Shanghai. The kids would have athletic competition, so these kids are in their uniforms. But they also, when they weren't competing in sports, wore military uniforms. And the boys were told to wear their military uniform when they had their bar mitzvah and also when they got married. So in 1931, when the Japanese came to Harbin, the Jews were presented with a dilemma. Do they stay in Harbin under Japanese occupation, even though Harbin was their home, some had been there for generations, or do they leave? And they had two choices, really. They could go to Shanghai, where it was still free, or they could go back to the Soviet Union. And it wasn't going back because many had left before it was Soviet. So two books address this dilemma. One is Secrets and Spies by Mara Mustafin. She's an Australian who was born in Harbin. Her family had come before the Bolshevik Revolution. They were left-leaning. And in the 30s, her aunt and uncle and grandparents decided to go to the Soviet Union. And after a few years, only her grandmother is still alive. And her grandmother goes to a camp, a labor camp in Kazakhstan. And no one knows what happens to those family members who die. So when Mara is a young girl, her family leaves Harbin, and they leave in 1959, which I thought was amazing. Mao came in 1949, and a year before that, the Jewish community in Shanghai was all but gone. I think in 1950 there were maybe 100 left of the 25,000. So it was very interesting that the Harbin Jews stayed even several years after Mao came in. It was 10 years. Things in China were getting very grim in 1959. They started the second year of a huge famine that wiped out 45 million people. But Mara's family moved to Australia, and Mara became part of the Australian Foreign Service. And in the 90s, she went back to Harbin, and she went to the Soviet Union, and she wanted to find out what happened to her family. She becomes friends with an ex-KGB officer, and he helps her uncover the secrets. And it was read like a spy thriller. I mean, it was just fascinating, and I loved it. And I thought she did a great job of showing what the Jewish community was like in Harbin at the time. Another memoir from that time is Jakob Lieberman's My China, and his family comes to Harbin in 1900. They are not left-leaning, and they are Zionists. They don't want anything to do with the Soviet Union, never had lived under the Soviets, never want to live under the Soviets. And the Liebermans send Yaakov, after he's completed some years in Harbin at school, they send him to Shanghai. He also goes to Pyongyang, which is now the capital of North Korea, and he studies there. When the war gets intense in Harbin, the family moves down to Shanghai, and they stay until about 1948. Yaakov is very involved in Beitar. He talks about Beitar a lot in his book, and he wears the uniform at his bar mitzvah when he gets married to another Jewish woman from China. And he's part of the first wave of Jews to leave China for Israel. Now, most of the Jews in Shanghai left for Israel, the U.S., or Australia. And because he was in Beitar, he was in charge of settling those first waves of Jews that immigrated to Israel. But as much as he loved Israel, he didn't stay. He went to Japan to finish his bachelor degree and to get a master's degree. And in 1970, he had a business opportunity in Taiwan, and so he moved there for 15 years with his family and started a Jewish community there. And they all moved to San Diego in 1985. So those are two books about Harbin, and I thought they present a good spectrum of the not just the political leanings, but the families that live there and their options. Hailar is a smaller town outside of Harbin that had a teeny Jewish community, maybe 800 to 900. Mara Mustafin's family also lived there, and this is the synagogue from there, so I just thought I'd show you that. Our last city in mainland China is Tianjin. It was also settled by Russian Jews, and it is near Beijing. This is Tianjin in the 30s. This is the synagogue in Tianjin. This is just a committee at the Tianjin synagogue, and it was taken in, the date said 1937 to 1940, so it was taken at that time. This is Beitar in Tianjin, the uniforms. One of the only books that I found about Tianjin at that time in the Jewish community was China Dreams. It's a memoir by Isabel Maynard. She was born and raised in Tianjin and left in around 1948 when she was 19, and her family went to San Francisco. So it's not so much a fluid memoir as a collection of essays about her childhood in Tianjin. And she talks about the anti-Semitism with the white Russian community. She talks about how the Jews are pretty insular, they live amongst themselves, and it's quite scandalous when she goes off on her own to the Chinese section of town and doesn't tell her mother. So I thought that was a nice introduction to Jewish Tianjin life. And there's another book I put on my bibliography, which is Midnight in Peking by Paul French. It's a very depressing murder mystery. And there's a very minor character who is a Polish Jew who lives in Tianjin. And he's a good guy, but there's a lot of really horrible people in that book. But it just shows another side of Jewish life in China. Our last stop is the British Crown Colony of Hong Kong, and wasn't part of China back then. It's only been returned to China 15 years ago. This is Hong Kong in the 30s. This is Oalea. Oalea is the oldest temple in Asia that's still being used, and it was built by Jacob Sassoon too. He built Oa Rachel after his wife in Shanghai, and Leah was his mother, so Oalea means the house of Leah. This was completed in 1902, as I said before, and it, apart from the 4 years during the Japanese occupation, it's been used as a temple. And my friend Erica in Hong Kong said no one really knows what happened during those 4 years. The Japanese had it. They might have used it as a stable or an ammunitions warehouse, but the most important thing was that the Torahs were saved by the congregants. This is inside the temple. I was here in April, and my husband took this picture. So all the woodwork and the tile and the furniture is original. The paint has been restored, and the bima was plastered and painted over, but recently someone chipped away and found this woodwork underneath that was beautiful, so that's been restored. It is an Orthodox temple, so the men sit on the lower floor, the women on the upper floor. This is the Peninsula Hotel, built by the Kadoorie family, and it is significant for the war because on Christmas Day in 1941, the British and the Japanese met here so the British could sign over the surrender papers. The Japanese occupied this hotel for the duration of the war. They renamed it the Toa Hotel, and it has since been given back to the Kadoories. They run this one and many other peninsulas around the world, including Chicago. This is China Light and Power. The Kadoories also ran the power company, so it's the equivalent of Commonwealth Edison here. This building was built in 1940, and it still is there, although there's many high-rises around it. So a couple of books about Hong Kong during that time were Back to Emily Han. She will never see Sin Mei, her partner, again. But she starts another relationship with a married man, and he is the chief of British intelligence. His name is Charles Boxer. His wife is back in England, and Emily and Charles have this relationship, and one day she mentions to him that she'd like to have a baby. And he says, okay. So they have a baby. And during the war, Charles is interned, and Emily is not. So he's put into a prison of war camp. Emily is able to stay outside of the camps, but in return, she has to teach English to Japanese officers. But if she doesn't like what they say, she will speak her mind. She stands up for herself. And one day, an officer insulted her, so she slapped him across the face. And in 1943, she was repatriated back to the U.S. And the day before she left, that officer came to say goodbye to her, and he slapped her across the face. Emily returned to the U.S., and Charles Boxer was released after the war. They married, so he divorced his first wife. They had another daughter, but Emily, as free-spirited as always, didn't want to live in England, and I guess Boxer didn't want to live in New York, so they lived across the pond for the rest of their marriage until Charles Boxer died. And Emily lived into her 90s and passed away in the 1990s, and still worked for the New Yorker up until the end. The last book is a very fascinating story about the British surrender and what happened right after that. It's called Escape from Hong Kong, and it has two supporting Jewish characters who are... one's a war hero and one's just really eccentric. Monia Talin is a man who is from Russia. He came to Shanghai in 1919 and was involved in a volunteer corps there that would defend Shanghai. And they had a Jewish group, a Jewish corps that did that. So in 1934, he came to Hong Kong. He was an intelligence officer in the British Navy by 1941. And this is what was going on in Hong Kong. The Japanese were... had been there. They invaded Pearl Harbor Day. By Christmas Day, the British were going to surrender. And there was a one-legged admiral of the Chinese Navy that had to escape. If the Japanese caught him, he'd be killed. And so the British agreed to take him out of Hong Kong and bring him up to free China. And they had to pass through a part of China that was occupied by the Japanese too, and Chinese warlords. So they... the British decided to do this. Monia Talin was the mastermind behind this plan. He and three others were the intelligence that whisked this admiral away, and there was a big entourage, maybe I think 60 people total. The British Navy had people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, England, or Great Britain, and they all worked together, and they escaped. And Monia Talin, once he got the admiral out of harm's way, he went to India and fought the rest of the war for the British. He came back to Hong Kong after the war and became involved in the Jewish community. But his dream in life was to become a British citizen, and that was sadly never granted. So he eventually went to Australia with his wife and lived out his last days there. The other character in the book who's Jewish is a scruffy guy who born in Poland, went to the UK at an early age. He was a street urchin in London. His family sent him to Saskatchewan in Canada. His name was Morris Cohen, and in Canada, Morris learned to shoot. And he met Chinese railroad workers there. And he ended up in China as Sun Yat-sen's bodyguard. Sun Yat-sen was the father of modern China. So Morris always had two guns with him. He was called Two Gun Cohen. And in 1941, he was in Hong Kong working as a spy. He would just loiter around the Gloucester Hotel, which is one of the big hotels in Hong Kong then. It's no longer there. And he would just listen out for information that was useful to the British. So as Monia Talin and his group were whisking away the one-legged admiral, they were driving down one of Hong Kong Island's major streets. Suddenly a man in a white suit jumped in front of their car holding out his two revolvers, and it was Two Gun Cohen. The car stopped, obviously. They asked him, or he asked them what was going on, They told him they were escaping. They asked if he wanted to come with them, and he said no, he was going to stay for the fighting. So in his signature white suit, he stayed, and he was interned as a prisoner of war. After the war, he loved Hong Kong and China so much that he kept his connections there. He went back to Canada, but he would return. He'd go to Hong Kong, he'd go to Taiwan, he'd go to China, and he was one of the few who moved back and forth between mainland China and Taiwan easily. He, before the war in Hong Kong, he was named a general in the Nationalist Army. He was the only non-Chinese to have been done so. And he would go back to Asia and tell these really tall tales about his heroics. And I guess his wife got sick of him, so she divorced him. He ended up in England living with his sister, and he died in 1970. So that is the end of the presentation. I have copies of Asian Jewish Life for Everybody. It's a magazine celebrating Jews in Asia from back then and now and anywhere in between. And my reviews of the Harbin books are in it. There's also a feature about a man who was in Shanghai during the war. So thank you so much, and I would love to take questions.